This has been such an exciting and historic week for the pro-life movement. Tomorrow will be 1 week since the Supreme Court handed down its historic ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson, which is summed up in these historic words: held, the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. Roe and Casey are overruled, and the authority to regulate abortion is returned to the people and their elected representatives. This is a hard-won, long-fought victory indeed. But a victory on this scale spells change for the pro-life movement. And the fight continues in a completely different legal environment than before. We're honored to have two expert commentators with us today to discuss: Mike Farris, President and CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom, and Nicole Hunt, attorney and life issues analyst at Focus on the Family. Mike and Nicole, we are so honored to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Thank you.
So I want to firstly open the floor with a very general question for each of you. And Nicole, I'll go to you first. What does the decision of the court in Dobbs v. Jackson mean in the immediate days and weeks to come?
Well, I think the first and really the most important thing that came out of this decision is that instead of one fight for life at the United States Supreme Court, we're actually going to see a fight for life in 50 states. And it's really already started. There are at least 12 states that have activated trigger laws. That's laws that protect life in their states and prohibit abortion. And those states are already starting to see action in court. The ACLU and Planned Parenthood are coming after them. They're coming after them in different methods, but what we're seeing the most is that they're trying to argue that state constitutions have a right to privacy that encompasses the right to have an abortion. So we're going to see this play out in the courts, but I think that the overall theme here is that the pro-life movement needs to be ready and willing to get involved in what's happening at the state level, because things are getting very active and very fluid at the states.
Thank you, Nicole. Mike, how would you characterize this new landscape in the immediate days and weeks to come?
Well, following up on the very good answer that Nicole got us going with, is that the principal duty to defend these laws falls with the attorney generals. And in most of these states, the reason they have pro-life laws is that they're Republican office holders, generally speaking, in place, including the state attorney generals. And so the Republican attorney generals are the primary people that are defending these statutes. ADF worked with the Mississippi Attorney General's office very directly in the Dobbs case. And we do this routinely with other state attorney generals. So we help them. We volunteer, we do a variety of things. Sometimes we come on the pleadings with the state AGs in defending their state laws. But we have been gearing up for this eventuality for months now, knowing that this is exactly what's going to happen, because it's a two-pronged legal and political approach, and that is the state legislatures on the one hand and the state courts on the other hand. And Nicole correctly outlined that it's the claim is that the state constitution does that. Now, there was a case that ADF was deeply involved in Iowa that was just decided several days ago, just before the Dobbs decision, where the Iowa Supreme Court had previously ruled that there was a state constitutional right to abortion. We represented legislators in Iowa in that litigation, and the Supreme Court of Iowa just reversed itself. Now, there was a famous election battle in Iowa that a number of people that I know led the fight to throw out some of the justices that had invented a state-based constitutional right to abortion. So, there were a lot of moving parts there. But at the end of the day, Iowa did the right thing here recently and got that cleaned up. And so, but we're essentially seeing that same fight play out in a number of other states right now.
So Mike, can you share a little bit with us about the circumstances in Mississippi that precipitated the Dobbs ruling?
Sure. ADF and other allies were looking for a form of a law that would challenge Roe and its counterpart of Casey versus Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And so it was those two cases together that had to be reversed. And in order to do that, we wanted to encourage a state to enact a law that pushed the deadline for getting a lawful abortion earlier than the recognized viability standard. And the strategy, frankly, was to try to get Chief Justice Roberts' vote, because at this stage, 7 years ago or whatever it was, the only way to 5 votes included Justice Roberts. And so we thought that we could get him on a 15-week thing, and that might, what would likely crack the foundations of Roe versus Wade. And then in a later case, you come and clean up the mess and get it reversed. But that all changed when Justice Ginsburg passed away, and Justice Barrett replaced her. And so the strategy became different. And we were we were on the legal team with the Mississippi Attorney General's office. And Lynn Fitch, the Attorney General of Mississippi, made the decision herself that it was time to swing for the fences, that the best defense of the Mississippi law was that Roe and Casey were wrongly decided in the first place. And so she made the decision, and we helped her, but it was her decision, her leadership, and her Solicitor General, Scott, did a terrific job in oral argument. And so that's the strategy became, a full-on attempt to reverse Roe in the aftermath of the change of personnel there at the Supreme Court, because we now had 5 votes, and that did not include Chief Justice Roberts. So that was the rationale behind it.
So drilling down just a little bit, you talking about Roe in particular. So over the years, and particularly in recent days, Roe has been called bad jurisprudence. Justice Thomas even wrote the following in his opinion, that 50 years have passed since Roe, an abortion advocate still cannot coherently articulate the right or rights at stake, proves the obvious. The right to abortion is ultimately a policy goal in desperate search of a constitutional justification. Mike, why was Roe so flawed?
Well, the Supreme Court made up the policy out of thin air. And when you do that, and people keep pressing the point and demanding that, you point to a valid constitutional text that has an original meaning that reaches the result that you claim, well, that was a hopeless errand, because they couldn't do it. And, in Roe, I'd been teaching Roe at Patrick Henry College for years, suggesting that they had not even suggested that the 14th Amendment due process clause. One of my students pointed out there was one sentence where they say, well, the 14th Amendment's due process clause, as we think it might be, it was that weak. We think it might be found in that clause, but it could be here, it could be there, it could be, reminds me of the line from Scarlet Pimpernel. They seek him here, they seek him there, they seek him everywhere. But the constitutional justification, like the Scarlet Pimpernel, remains elusive, and so they couldn't find one, and that's because it's really clear. The history that you needed to answer the question was in the majority opinion in Roe versus Wade. No, it's that history is more thoroughly and even more accurately stated in Justice Alito's majority opinion here. But Roe had enough, and that is, it was really clear that America had a pro-life policy in place, and abortion was illegal at the time of the adoption of the 14th Amendment. And to claim at that same date, where abortion was illegal in 1868 throughout America as a general matter, and the details are in the opinion, you can't have the right to an abortion and it being banned at the same time. Those things cannot historically coexist. And it was only by throwing historical dust in the air, by looking at ancient Greece and Rome and Israel and their favorite vacation spot in Europe and, Marvel comic books or something. I don't know where all they looked, but they just looked at a variety of sources and said, well, we don't really know, because, they looked at what amounted to a high school junior's term paper on the history of abortion and said, we don't know what this is all about, so we can't make a decision. And they went off and made a decision anyway. And that kind of reasoning can't stand scrutiny over time.
Nicole, what would you add to that analysis?
Yeah, to that point, I would simply add that, there's a clear separation of powers built into the Constitution, and this is exactly why. What the Roe Court did was they stepped out of their lane when their job is to interpret the law, right? Legislatively, the legislature makes the law, the judicial interprets the law, and the executive branch, they carry out the law. So what they did in Roe was they decided that they would be the legislators, they would be the policymakers, and they would decide what would be the best policy moving forward. And what they did really was unconstitutional. Those rights should be reserved to the people and their elected legislators. And that is exactly what was restored when the Dobbs decision came down. It was the correct constitutional order of things. And so that is really one of the most important aspects of this, is that the powers are now equaled out again. The Supreme Court doesn't have the only say over what abortion policy is in America.
Right. So with that decision returned back to the states, Nicole, what are some of the types or categories of laws that we might start to see taking effect?
Well, to your point that the rights have been returned to the people and their elected representatives, I do think it's important to add that we might see action at the federal level. It's very unlikely, but there is power that is given to the Congress as well. And so Congress makes a lot of laws that have federal impact. Now, it's very unlikely. We saw that Congress tried to do that to protect abortion under federal statute. And of course, they didn't have enough votes to see that pass in the Senate. However, it did pass in the House. So there are thankfully stops in place that make sure that one party doesn't just run away with something, that there's got to be more of a collective agreement on what the policy is. So thankfully, the Senate wasn't able to get enough votes to end debate on that very, very bad abortion bill. But moving forward, if there were enough senators, at least 60, who would all agree on some type of abortion policy, whether it puts abortion into federal statute or whether it protects life in federal statute, that is a possibility at the federal level. Another thing that's a possibility at the federal level is a constitutional amendment. Now that would be even harder, because not only would it have to come out of Congress, there would be agreement on that, but there would also have to be 3/4 of the states that would agree to whatever it is that we're adding to the Constitution. Now that at this point, there's not even that much agreement. If we look at what the layout of the land is when it comes to abortion, there are about 26 states that have been identified as will protect life or are likely to protect life. And then that means there are also 24 states that have either in statute, in practice, or in their constitution protected abortion. So there's really not enough there to see a constitutional amendment at this time, but that doesn't rule out the fact that that is a viable method of changing law if there was enough of an agreement between the parties. So barring the options federally, that takes us back to the states. And what that means now, as I mentioned, is that there are 26 states that are likely to protect life, but that doesn't bar future legal action. As I mentioned at the beginning, Planned Parenthood, ACLU, they are already going after states that are pro-life states, trying to argue that either state law protects it already by practice or their state constitutions protect it. So the battle really is far from over when it comes to the states, and particularly when it comes to the pro-life states, because obviously these organizations aren't going after the 24 states that already protect abortion. They're specifically targeting the pro-life states. And the truth is with politics being the way it is and elected officials coming in and out of office so frequently, there really is no for sure this is the way the state's always going to lean. If we start to see states turn more pro-life, perhaps states that were formerly pro-abortion might move that direction. And that could also happen the other way. So really the pro-life movement needs to be on guard and ready to be engaged at all times, because right now anything could happen at the states.
Right. Thank you for that. Mike, what are your expectations in terms of action that we may see in the states on abortion law?
Well, there's going to be a variety of approaches. And our position is that states should enact as pro-life of a law as they can possibly do. And that's going to vary based on the political circumstances of the state. Here, I live in Virginia. Glenn Youngkin has proposed to match Mississippi's 15-week law. That's not my preference, but that will stop a lot of abortions. And of course, Virginia is on record the opposite right now. It's in one of the 24 states. And so to flip Virginia out of the bad category into the good category at all is an improvement. And that's probably about as much as you could accomplish in Virginia right now, which, turning the ship around and getting it going in the right direction is a big accomplishment. So that would be a good thing. But whether they can have a heartbeat law or a 12-week bill or better yet, protect life from the moment of conception, that's our goal. And so, obviously, life of the mother is a given. Every time we're talking about this, and that's extraordinarily rare medically, and it basically is limited to tubal pregnancies. It's when that really is occurring. And in that case, you're really not doing an abortion in a traditional sense. You're doing a different thing too. But life of the mother would be honored in every approach. So there can be a variety. Now at the federal level, there are a few things that Congress can do that is clearly within their jurisdiction, including banning interstate shipments of abortion pills through the mail or through FedEx, common carriers, UPS, that sort of thing. And that is something that Congress should do. Now, whether they're not going to do it under the current configuration of Congress, but after the elections in November, that becomes a real possibility. Of course, President Biden wouldn't sign that, but hopefully the next president would. The other, beyond that, there becomes a real question of whether or not Congress has the authority, either under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, or 14th Amendment, rather, or under the Commerce Clause to enact such a law. I personally don't think that they do, on either side, on either the pro-life side or the pro-abortion side. And I guarantee you that if Congress passes a pro-abortion law, we will challenge it as being beyond the scope of congressional authority. And so that should not be, you should take it as a given they're going to try, but it shouldn't be taken as a given that Nicole correctly said that politically it's pretty dubious right now, but it's even more dubious when you add a legal challenge to a pro-abortion law using the Commerce Clause or some other method. I think it would end up with the same fate as the Violence Against Women's Act, because rape, which is bad, is not an act of interstate commerce. And the Supreme Court said that and said, we prosecute rape trials in state courts. And that's what that amounted to. And so we're effectively be in the same situation here with this. And so I'm optimistic about us keeping this at the federal, away from the federal level, except for things like mail order abortions, and keeping it at the state level.
Mike, in your view, what is the best response to those who make the claim that this decision in some way violates what they would call separation of church and state?
Well, these people, just show their complete ignorance of tradition, Supreme Court decisions, all kinds of things. The idea that if a law happens to parallel a law or a principle that's in a religious tradition, that is not unconstitutional. Now that decision was made by the Supreme Court in the Roe era on a question of abortion funding, and the Supreme Court said, no, that's nonsensical. That's a non-starter in a courtroom. Beyond that, the Supreme Court didn't pass a law, and so legislatures, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So if somebody's going to do an establishment clause claim, which is the correct way to say separation of church and state, you got to pass a law. Well, there's no law being passed here. And so if you want to claim that, Mississippi's law violates the separation of church and state, well, at least you've got one element of about 15 elements that you have to make a claim. But if you're going to talk about the Supreme Court decision, you got 0 elements. There's no component of that where that makes sense whatsoever. And so it's just people shooting their mouth off who don't know what they're talking about. It's the proper response to that is to laugh at them.
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate that. That's very, very helpful. Thank you. Nicole, turning back to you, what can citizens do and what should they know about advocating for pro-life policies on the state level? And at the same time, what kind of measures might we expect the abortion lobby to be taking in the opposite direction?
To your first question, it's really important that members of the pro-life community, whether you live in a state that protects life or a state that protects abortion, that you stay heavily engaged in what your state legislatures are doing. Here in Colorado, this last legislative session, so Colorado is known to be a state that has late-term abortion. People travel here for their late-term abortions. We have a late-term abortion doctor in Boulder who will perform them. And So when the abortion industry got wind of what was happening and the likelihood that Roe might be overturned, the first thing they wanted to do in this state, even though by practice, abortion is widely accepted and not prosecuted, what they wanted to do is they wanted to get it protected by state statute first. And then their next step is to get it protected by the state constitution, which will end up being a vote that they're likely to put to the citizens of Colorado, protecting abortion under our state constitution. So when this happened this last fall and the spring, Focus on the Family reached out to all of our members in Colorado, and we said, this bill is going to not only statutorily protect abortion under our state law, but it is going to deny rights to unborn babies in their mother's wombs. We have to stand up and we have to say something, because our Christian faith is compelling us to testify to the truth that all life is made in the image of God. And there's the Imago Dei that we need to be willing to stand up and we need to be willing to testify in front of our legislators and tell them that. And so thankfully we had thousands of people show up between the House committee hearings and the Senate committee hearings and even to rallies. But unfortunately, this bill was passed. Now in Colorado, abortion is protected by state statute. That being said, it is still important for every pro-life person to show up and to be a voice for life, because we need to put the brakes on this as much as we can. We need to make it as painful as possible for these abortion legislators to continue pushing these pieces of death legislation, really. So it's really important for members who are for pro-life members who are in states that are protecting abortion, that you show up as often and as frequently as you can, and in love, but in truth, convey what we know to be true, which is that the sanctity of life ought to be protected, and that human life is a human right, and it needs to be protected under state law. So that would be the first thing I would say. And then secondly, I would say there's also a way for citizens to get involved in trying to repeal what is happening, what measures, I should say, are being pushed. In Kansas, for instance, a state Supreme Court decided fairly recently that their Kansas Constitution protects the right to an abortion. Well, in Kansas, this August, actually, the citizens of Kansas will have the opportunity to vote on a measure. It's called Value Them Both. And what it would do is repeal this state Supreme Court constitutional interpretation. And it would tell in the Constitution, it would say that there is no right to an abortion and that there is a protection for life. So there are ways for the pro-life community to be engaged and don't just concede a lost battle. Stay engaged, stay involved. The pro-life movement is not going to give up. And in fact, this is the time, it's more critical than ever for us to be willing to be engaged, because hearts and minds now are ours to be able to try to move for life. And the truth is we can work as hard as we can to try to make abortion illegal. But what we really want, the ultimate goal, is that we would make abortion unthinkable. And so that means getting into conversations with our friends and with our family and standing up for pro-life values at the state level.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Mike, what would your recommendation be to citizens who want to get involved in advocating for pro-life policy on the state level?
Well, most states have a family policy council. Focus on the Family was involved in launching these back in the old days. In fact, I went to the very first organizational meeting of those back when Focus was still in California, long before they came to Colorado. And so they are among the best organizations to be affiliated with at state level. There are state-based right to life groups in most states. And so getting connected to one of those two groups at your state level, it's just a simple internet search to find out, where they are. I'm sure that Focus probably has a directory of those on their website, I'm guessing. And Family Research Council as well would be able to give you links. So I would say, get a hold of one of those groups and get involved. The other thing is, I would encourage people to get their churches involved. There's a real power there, and There's some talk, or not just talk. There's a movement afoot that says, if we, the church, are going to get involved in these political issues like protecting the right to life, then we're not going to be able to preach the gospel. Well, there's a lot of examples that we can give to the contrary, but I'm going to use my own church. I'm an elder at a church called Cornerstone Chapel in Leesburg, Virginia. And our pastor is as pro-life and as out there as you get. When Virginia was considering pro-abortion legislation, he called out legislators by name, and it was great. And yet on Easter Sunday a year ago, we had 1,100 people tell us that they prayed to receive Christ that Sunday. On Christmas, it was 400 people prayed to receive Christ. We have thousands of people every year that respond to the gospel in a church that's just out there and very strongly. So the idea that, you got to make a choice of one or the other, I can tell you from experience, that's not true. So get your church involved. In fact, the more likely they are to stand up for life, the more likely they are to stand up for the truth of the gospel. And the more you soft pedal the whole counsel of the word of God, the less likely you are to take a stand on all the issues that matter, the deity of Christ, the inerrancy of Scripture. These things tend to run in parallel. And so, get your church involved. And if you're in a weak church, get yourself a better church.
That's a word to the wise, Mike. And what you brought up there, there's an important tie-in between policy and ministry and also Christian communications. And I want to turn to that subject a little bit, just in terms of who our membership is. We have a membership of Christian broadcasters, of ministry organizations, of communicators of all kinds. And so, Nicole, I want to ask you, in your view, what are the new messages on the other side of this victory? What does pro-life communications look like after this? And what are organizations like Focus on the Family doing next?
I think this is the time that we double down in reminding people that this is about helping moms and this is about saving babies. We can only say that if we're engaged in really promoting the help that pregnancy resource centers are to women who find themselves in unplanned pregnancies and are trying to figure out what to do next. So I think what's really important is we promote that this is about mom and this is about baby, because that's where our heart is, right? I think the abortion industry for so long has just been pushing this message. Make this decision out of fear, out of despair, out of hopelessness. The message of the pro-life community is that we want you to be empowered. We want you to know that we will help you find resources and we will help you find community. So we can only say those things if we're actually doing it. But the message is we need to do those things so that we can say those things. And we need to live that out so that women will want to choose life. I think the truth is that the majority of women would choose not to abort their baby if they felt like they had the resources or the community or the support. So if they don't have those things, the church, the pro-life community, we need to come alongside of them and we need to find ways to help them know that they do, and that the only option isn't death for their child, but they can be empowered to choose life for their child. Now, at Focus on the Family, we've launched a multi-million-dollar effort to really try to touch people's hearts and minds on this issue. We think that if women actually can make that connection between the baby that's growing in their body and its own personal life, its own personal development, this call that it has on its own life to grow up and to become somebody, that there's going to be an opportunity for that woman to see life in her belly instead of just clumps of tissue. So we're launching this ad that maybe you've seen it before, but it starts with the development of a baby, that fertilized egg. And then the fertilized egg is growing, and it starts to talk about all the things it wants to do, how it wants to meet its mother, and how it can't wait to get outside and go play. And the truth is that if that baby continued its growth progression, that is exactly what it would do. It would be excited to see its mom every morning, and it would be excited to go outside and play at the playground and all of these things. So when we humanize that baby in the womb, it reminds people that it's not just their own person that they worry about. They actually have another person inside of them. And so one of the things that we've done, it's a program that we've supported now for over 10 years. It's called Option Ultrasound. And what we do is we get ultrasounds We partner with pregnancy resource centers to get ultrasounds into their resource center if they don't have one yet, so that moms who might be considering abortion, when they come in, they get a chance to hear their baby's heartbeat. Some of them, it's for the first time. And if they're further along, they actually get to see their baby's profile. And when we humanize the baby in the womb, when the mom is reminded of just how much growth there is, that there really is a separate life in there, more likely than not, she will choose life for that child. And so what we're trying to do is build connections between science, between a mom's heart, and meeting the mom in her place of need, whatever those needs are, helping her have the resources in the community that she needs so that she's empowered to choose life.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Nicole. And I think that for those who are watching on Zoom, you should see some links coming up in the chat to some of these different initiatives so that you can check them out in more detail. Mike, I wanted to turn to you. Ever since the Dobbs opinion draft was leaked to when the opinion was actually released by the Supreme Court, we've seen increased skepticism towards the institution, which is something I'd like to come back to. But we've also seen an enormous spike in vitriol and violence toward pro-life advocates, Christian communicators, toward the pregnancy resource centers. In some ways, it's a very dark time for those who have been in the movement, even though it's on the heels of this monumental victory. How can the pro-life movement capture what is going on right now that is so challenging and use it for good?
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that courage isn't fearlessness. Courage is doing what's right, even if you have a good reason to be afraid. And so the pro-life pregnancy centers, and I can't support Nicole's statement too strongly. What she was saying about pro-life pregnancy centers, 100% endorse, because if for no other reason, I had the privilege of arguing in the Supreme Court for them in 2018 when California tried to effectively shut down their pro-life pregnancy centers by putting up a requirement that all pregnancy centers give a what amounts to an ad, come get your free abortion from the state of California, call this 800 number. And they knew that the pro-life centers would refuse to do that, and they would use that as a pretense to shut them down. The Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional coercion of speech. I had the privilege of arguing that, and I got an in-depth look at the pregnancy centers. And you have to ask yourself, why would people take violence against the pregnancy centers? You know, they're just simply offering women an alternative. You know, nobody's forcing them to come there. There's no coercion involved. It's come here if you want help. And so, you know, any pretense that the other side is pro-choice is revealed by their violence against pregnancy centers. That means they're only one thing. They are just simply pro-death. They want to kill unborn babies. And that's all you can say about them, because otherwise they would be indifferent toward the pregnancy centers. And so we need to protect them. We need to be, you know, on guard for them. And, you know, I'm glad to know that we are work in the same building as one of the national offices for one of the major resource centers for pregnancies, CareNet. And I was talking to one of their staffers in the hallway the other day and making sure that they're getting community support and professional help to increase the safety of their centers. We need to stand up for the safety of these places. But it says something very, very clear about the other side. They're not about freedom. They're not about democracy. They're about death and totalitarianism and coercion and violence. And anybody who resorts to those tactics, you know, their claims that, you know, that they are supporting, you know, the democratic process, as if the Supreme Court majority in Roe versus Wade is how you conduct the democratic process. It is not. And it's nonsense. And there's just so much nonsense that's being paraded around as wisdom these days. But the good news is, I think that there's a lot of people in the middle of America that are just as happy to see this thing shifted back to the state level so that it can be de-escalated, so that every presidential election is no longer about the right to life at the Supreme Court. There are going to be other issues in the presidential election. Now, the Supreme Court is going to remain incredibly important, but it won't be, will they reverse Roe or won't they reverse Roe, driving that. And that needs to be taken out of politics in the presidential election. It has no business there. It belongs at the state level and should stay there. And states can come up for the time being with a variety of approach. But I think we should emphasize, I know the focus believes this as well. We're not going to rest until America is pro-life. And I think that that's going to require a constitutional amendment. And yes, right now there's, a little more than half the states that are pro-life or lean pro-life. But there's some squishiness on the other side. I mean, Virginia was in the wrong camp until last November. Now it's in the right camp. And so states can be flipped. And we've got to get to 38 states. So Nicole's math is exactly right. We got to get to 38 states. And when we can get to 38 states, we can either get 2/3 of Congress, which is a very hard thing to do, or you can have a convention of the states for the limited purpose of a pro-life amendment. There's already 13 existing convention of the states applications on the books for calling for an Article 5 amendments convention for the right to life exclusively for that subject. And so you just need 21 more states to join them, and you could have a convention for that purposes. But there's no point calling it yet because you couldn't get it ratified. You need to get, let's build toward the 38, and then we can look for a constitutional solution at that point in time.
That's very powerful. Thank you. And Nicole, what would you add to that conversation on capturing some of these challenges to the pro-life movement and the pro-life resource centers for good?
Well, I think Mike did a great job on where we need to spend our resources and energy. I would just add 2 points that the pro-life movement needs to keep pressure on the Department of Justice and the FBI to investigate these criminal acts and to prosecute them. There needs to be accountability, because if the left is not held accountable for these violent acts, they're going to keep doing it. And the truth is that the fight has just started at the state level. They're going to be mad no matter what. In fact, and it's so nonsensical, even here in Colorado, where abortion is still legal, there was a pregnancy resource center that the night that the Supreme Court case came out was attacked and vandalized. It was there was a fire. So they're not very sensical. They're going to do violent acts. We need to hold them accountable so that they stop the violence. That's the first thing. And the second thing I would say is we really need to be praying for them. There is a darkness, a sinisterness to what they're doing. They really are pro-death. And we need to be praying that the Lord would reveal truth to them, and that they would turn away from their wicked ways, and that they would be able to see the truth, that there really is life that begins at conception, and that they would join us with that same intensity and passion that they have for pro-death culture, that they would use that to help promote a pro-life culture. So prayer is very, very, very important.
That is so crucial. And to be honest with you, Nicole, if there was one call to action that came out of this entire call, I think we at NRB would be happy if it was simply pray for the pregnancy resource centers, because they're doing such important work. You wouldn't even know it from the way it's portrayed in the media, but there are more pregnancy resource centers than there are abortion clinics in America. And they're under attack right now. I mean, there have been several stories that have been reported all over the media from various perspectives, to be sure. But I was just reading today, this is a quote from a story: activists have begun tearing down signs, covering the windows with pro-abortion literature, taping the front door shut so that the staff is stuck inside, and the like. We've heard about the vandalism, we've heard about the fires, we've heard some of the statements made by Jane's Revenge urging things like bombing, burning, the like. These resource centers need to be kept in our prayers, and they're not just centers, they're not just physical locations, but they're people who are giving of their time and giving of their energy, working around the clock. They're not necessarily safe when they come to those buildings to volunteer or to work professionally. We want to be praying really for their safety, but also for their increased opportunity. So thank you very much for that reminder. I want to turn back to Mike on another question about the Supreme Court in particular. There's a lot of conversation from those who oppose the Dobbs ruling about the legitimacy of the institution itself. Do you think that this decision has the potential to trigger renewed attempts to pack the court, expand the court, otherwise overhaul SCOTUS?
Well, I think that the court did the very best thing they could do to restore legitimacy if you're actually paying attention and actually believe in the rule of law. The rule of law means that only legislators make the law, not judges, not presidents. We elect, that's the definition of a Republican form of government. Who makes your law? Your elected legislators. That's what makes it a republic. And so where the Supreme Court said, we improperly took that power away from the people and from their elected legislators in 1973, and we're giving it back. That adds to the legitimacy of the court in anybody's fair-minded understanding. Now, because people believe the ends justify the means, and because they don't believe in the rule of law, and they're just, they want the policy outcomes they want, there are people mad at the Supreme Court right now. That's true. Conservatives have been mad at the Supreme Court for a very long time because of decisions like Roe. But this court's term, in my opinion, is the best of my lifetime. The good, today's decision about the EPA, nobody would think that was cool, except maybe all of us PhD related people, since one of our graduates successfully argued that case, Lindsay C., the Solicitor General of West Virginia. But that case was about this. Who makes the environmental laws for our country? Does Congress do it? Or can the unelected EPA create policies that cost tens of millions of billions of dollars and thousands of jobs, and there's no consequences? The reason Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution is there is to say only legislatures make law. Why? Because legislatures are politically accountable to the people. That's why. And so we want that. And so the Supreme Court should be valued when it stays in its lane, does what the Constitution says. It's deciding cases and controversies that require them to look at the words of the Constitution, decide what they mean, and then they pick winners and losers of particular cases based on a fair reading of the original meaning of the whatever phrase of the Constitution's in play at the time. And you gain legitimacy when you do that over time. They've done a good start at that in this time. And I think over the long haul, America will get it. We elect the lawmakers. We don't elect the Supreme Court as our great, philosopher king gods who have all this super, power that can do anything they want to do, and nobody can check them. That is what's dangerous, and we need to get back to a Supreme Court that acts like a court, not like a legislature.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you so much for your time and your expertise, and I want to offer you both a parting thought or a closing word before you go. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak to our NRB audience. Nicole, do you have any closing thoughts?
Maybe just a word of encouragement for listeners. There's really never been such an exciting time to be part of the pro-life movement. Momentum is on the side of life. Science is on the side of life. And now it's time to get all 50 states on the side of life. So don't grow weary in doing good. At Focus on the Family, we have a saying, it's called seize this pro-life moment. This is our moment to get involved and to really make it count. So be a part of doing that in your community and in your state.
Thank you, Nicole. Mike, last word to you.
Sure. I want to just encourage people to realize they should never say that whatever they think is impossible is truly impossible. People thought that reversing Roe versus Wade was impossible. And just to put it in perspective, I have 10 kids and 28 grandchildren, with number 29 on the way. When Roe versus Wade was decided, I didn't have any kids, much less grandkids. My oldest daughter turned 47 this week. And so Roe's just a little bit older than my oldest child. That's how long we suffered under this. And for that long, we thought it was impossible. And in what amounts to 2 generations, it took us that long to reverse that. Now, I had the privilege of being involved deeply in the homeschooling movement for over 25 years. And we saw a generational switch there. It took one generation, it took 25 years to go from homeschooling being illegal everywhere, at least perceived as such, to it being recognized as legal everywhere. That was a generational win. We've seen a generational shaping win here this last week. And people told us that the homeschool win was impossible. God delivered the victory. People told us it was impossible to reverse Roe versus Wade. God delivered the victory. And so we should have the stick-to-itiveness and the courage and ultimately the faith in our Heavenly Father that He's going to deliver. It's our responsibility to be long-suffering, to be at it, to continue at this. And if we do that faithfully, there's nothing that's impossible for God. And therefore, anything that we're trying to do that we know is consistent with his will. It's not impossible. It's just going to take a while, and let's go get it done through the power of God.
Thank you so much, Mike. That's such an encouraging word. Thank you so much to both of you for your time, for your expertise, and also for your encouragement. And also to those who are part of the NRB membership and community who are joining on Zoom and on Facebook. We know that many of you have been in this fight for all of those years as well. And some have joined more recently, but we thank you for your diligence and for your courage and for the continued ways that Christian communicators will step up and be part of this fight. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to bringing you another program next time. Thank you for being with us.